They whispered that I didn't belong there, that I hadn't done enough for the neighborhood, that showing up empty-handed to my own sister's block party proved I never cared about the community. The organizing committee exchanged looks when I walked up in my old jeans and faded sweater. No casserole dish in hand, no folding chairs to contribute. Just me, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and the weight of assumptions I'd grown used to bearing. Then, Captain Williams stepped onto the makeshift stage, scanned the crowd, and when his eyes found mine, everything changed. He cleared his throat and said 5 words that made the entire block go silent. "General Rodriguez, thank you for your service." Want to know what happened next and why a simple thank you shifted the entire energy of that afternoon? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Carmen's block party started with her calling me at 7 a.m., panic threading through her voice like she'd just discovered a kitchen fire. I was already awake, sitting on my small apartment balcony with coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, watching the sunrise paint the downtown skyline in shades of amber and rose. Sleep had become optional years ago, a habit I'd never quite shaken from deployments where dawn meant movement and movement meant staying alive. "Maria, please tell me you're coming today," Carmen said without preamble. "Mrs. Henderson from the planning committee keeps asking who's bringing what from our family, and I've been stalling because I know you hate these things, but I really need you there." I took a sip of the cold coffee and grimaced. Carmen had been organizing this annual block party for Maple Street for 3 years running, ever since she'd moved into the house our grandmother left her. It was her way of putting down roots, of becoming the kind of neighbor she'd always wanted to be, the kind who knew everyone's kids' names and remembered birthdays and showed up with soup when someone got sick. "I'll be there," I told her, and I meant it. Carmen had done enough for me over the years. The least I could do was show up for her community thing, even if community things made my skin crawl. "You don't have to bring anything," she added quickly. "I know you're not really a cooking person, and Mrs. Henderson can be a little intense about contributions, but family is family, right?" After I hung up, I sat there for another hour, watching the city wake up below me. My apartment was small and sparse, decorated mostly with books and a few pieces of furniture that served their purpose without demanding attention. The only photograph on display was tucked on a shelf between a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt and a collection of poetry I'd been meaning to read for months. In it, Carmen and I stood together at her college graduation, both of us grinning like we'd just gotten away with something. She was wearing the cap and gown, I was in my dress uniform, home on leave between assignments. That photo was 7 years old now, taken back when people still asked me what I did for work, and I still tried to give answers that made sense to civilians. By noon, I was standing at the edge of Maple Street, taking in the controlled chaos of Carmen's block party. Someone had strung lights between the oak trees that lined the sidewalk, and folding tables covered in checkered tablecloths created a buffet line that stretched half the length of the block. Kids ran between the adults with the kind of wild energy that comes from being outdoors on a perfect Saturday. And somewhere, someone was playing music that mixed classic rock with current hits in a way that somehow worked. I spotted Carmen near the drinks table, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a sundress covered in tiny flowers that made her look younger than her 32 years. She was gesturing animatedly while talking to a woman I didn't recognize, probably explaining something about the schedule or the cleanup or one of the dozen other details she'd been obsessing over for weeks. I walked toward her, my leather satchel bumping against my hip with each step. The satchel was old, a gift from my first commanding officer when I'd made captain. It had traveled with me through more countries than I could count, carried documents and maps and sometimes just books when I needed something familiar in unfamiliar places. Today, it held nothing but my wallet, keys, and a small notebook I'd started carrying out of habit rather than necessity. "Maria!" Carmen's face lit up when she saw me, and she excused herself from her conversation to give me a hug that lasted long enough to feel genuine. "I'm so glad you made it. Come on, let me introduce you to everyone." The woman Carmen had been talking to was Mrs. Henderson, the planning committee leader she'd mentioned on the phone. Mrs. Henderson was probably in her 60s, with silver hair styled in a way that suggested regular salon appointments and a smile that felt more calculated than warm. She looked me up and down with the kind of quick assessment people do when they're trying to place you in their mental filing system. "This is my sister Maria," Carmen said. "She's just moved back to the area a few months ago." "How wonderful," Mrs. Henderson said, extending a hand with manicured nails painted a subtle pink. "Are you settling in well? What do you do for work?" It was such a normal question, the kind people asked at parties and grocery store checkout lines and anywhere else strangers made polite conversation. For most people, answering it was automatic. For me, it had become an exercise in creative editing. "I'm between jobs right now," which is technically true, just taking some time to figure out what's next. Mrs. Henderson's smile shifted slightly, not disappearing, but taking on a different quality. "Oh, I see. Well, that can be a good opportunity to get involved in the community. We always need volunteers for neighborhood improvement projects." Before I could respond, Carmen jumped in with the kind of protective energy that made me both grateful and uncomfortable. "Maria's been traveling a lot for work. She's just taking a break to recharge." "Traveling for work?" Mrs. Henderson repeated, and I could see her mental filing system working overtime. "What kind of work involves that much travel?" "Consulting," I said, which was the word I'd learned worked best. It was vague enough to discourage follow-up questions, but specific enough to sound legitimate. Carmen rescued me by suggesting we check out the food table, and we moved away from Mrs. Henderson toward the impressive spread the neighborhood had assembled. There were casseroles and salads and desserts arranged with the kind of care that spoke to hours of preparation. Each dish had a small card next to it listing the contributor's name and any relevant allergy information. "Sorry about that," Carmen said quietly as we picked up paper plates. "Mrs. Henderson means well, but she can be a little intense about knowing everyone's business." I loaded my plate with potato salad and what looked like homemade cornbread. "It's fine. I'm used to it." We found seats at one of the picnic tables someone had borrowed for the occasion, joining a couple with 2 young kids who were more interested in running around than eating. The conversation flowed easily enough, covering safe topics like the weather and local restaurants and whether the city would ever fix the potholes on Elm Street. I was starting to relax when Mrs. Henderson appeared at our table with a clipboard and the determined expression of someone on a mission. "I hope you don't mind me interrupting," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly concerned about our preferences.
"I'm just doing a final head count for thank you notes, and I wanted to make sure I had everyone's contributions recorded properly." She ran down the list of families, checking off names and corresponding dishes or services. The Johnsons had brought their famous mac and cheese. The Washingtons had provided all the paper goods. The Patel family had donated the drinks, and Mr. Chen had somehow procured the sound system that was currently pumping out classic rock at a volume that encouraged conversation without overwhelming it. "And the Rodriguez family," Mrs. Henderson said, pen poised over her clipboard. "Carmen, I have you down for organizing the whole event, of course. And Maria, what was your contribution?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a barbecue grill. Around the table, conversation didn't exactly stop, but it shifted, became more carefully casual. I felt the weight of attention without anyone obviously staring, the subtle pressure of a moment that mattered more than it should have. "I don't have a dish or anything. I just came to support Carmen." Mrs. Henderson's pen didn't move. "Oh, well, that's fine, of course. Family is important." She paused, and I could see her mental filing system updating my information. "It's just that we like to acknowledge everyone who makes the block party possible. Community events only work when everyone pitches in, you know? Carmen's face had gone tight in a way I recognized. She was trying not to snap, trying to maintain the neighborly relationships she'd worked so hard to build. Maria just moved back. She's still getting settled. Of course, Mrs. Henderson said again, but her smile had taken on that particular quality people use when they're being polite while making a point. I just think it's important that everyone understands how these things work. It takes a village, as they say. I set down my fork and looked directly at Mrs. Henderson. You're absolutely right. Community is important. Something in my tone made her hesitate, but she pressed on. Exactly, which is why participation matters so much. Even small contributions make a difference. Around us, the conversation at neighboring tables had definitely shifted. Not obvious eavesdropping, but the kind of heightened awareness that happens when people sense drama brewing. I could feel Carmen's tension radiating beside me, could see her calculating whether to jump in again or let me handle it. I understand, I said. I'll keep that in mind for next year. Mrs. Henderson nodded, apparently satisfied with having made her point. She moved on to the next table, clipboard in hand, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than it should have. Carmen waited until Mrs. Henderson was out of earshot before leaning toward me. I'm sorry about that. She gets weird about the contribution thing. Last year, she gave the Patel family grief because they brought store-bought cookies instead of homemade ones. It's fine, I said, though we both knew it wasn't really fine. It was the kind of small humiliation that stuck with you, the kind of moment that made you remember why you preferred to keep to yourself. The afternoon continued around us. Kids played games organized by parents who'd clearly done this before. Someone set up a volleyball net in the street, and pickup games rotated players in and out with the kind of casual inclusion that made it look effortless. I watched Carmen in her element, moving between groups with genuine warmth, remembering names and asking about family members, and somehow making everyone feel like they were exactly where they belonged. I stayed at the picnic table, nursing a can of soda and observing the rhythms of neighborhood life. It was like watching a documentary about a culture I could appreciate but didn't quite understand. These people had built something together, created traditions and connections that went beyond just living on the same street. They knew each other's struggles and celebrations, had probably weathered storms and emergencies as a community. Around 4 o'clock, I noticed a police car pull up at the far end of the block. Not unusual for a neighborhood event, probably just a routine check, or maybe someone had complained about the noise, though the music wasn't particularly loud, and it was well within reasonable hours for a weekend gathering. The officer who got out of the car was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a crisp uniform with sergeant stripes on his sleeves. He moved with the kind of measured confidence that suggested extensive experience, scanning the crowd with professional awareness while maintaining an approachable demeanor. A few people noticed him and waved, clearly familiar faces to each other. Carmen appeared at my side, following my gaze toward the police car. That's Captain Williams. He lives 2 streets over. Really nice guy. He usually stops by to say hello at community events. I watched Captain Williams make his way through the crowd, stopping to chat with families, accepting offers of food with polite thanks, generally being the kind of police presence that built trust rather than tension. He was good at it, I could tell. The way kids didn't automatically tense up when they saw him. The way elderly residents smiled and waved instead of looking worried. That kind of relationship with the community took time and consistent effort to build. Mrs. Henderson materialized near the drinks table where Captain Williams had stopped, and I could see her animated conversation even from across the block. She was gesturing with her clipboard, probably updating him on the event details or asking about permits or any of the dozen administrative things she seemed to manage with military precision. Then something shifted in their conversation. Mrs. Henderson looked in my direction, said something to Captain Williams that made his posture change slightly. He followed her gaze across the crowd until his eyes found mine, and I saw something I'd learned to recognize over the years. Not suspicion exactly, but the heightened attention of someone whose professional instincts had been activated. He excused himself from Mrs. Henderson, and started walking toward our table.
Carmen noticed the direction of his approach and straightened beside me, probably running through any possible reasons a police captain might want to speak with us specifically. "Afternoon, ladies," Captain Williams said when he reached us, his voice carrying the kind of authority that managed to be both respectful and commanding. "I hope you're enjoying the block party." "It's been wonderful," Carmen said. "Thank you for stopping by. I'm Carmen Rodriguez, and this is my sister Maria." Captain Williams nodded politely at Carmen. Then his attention settled on me with the kind of focus that felt like being examined under a microscope. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you're new to the area." "Relatively new," I said. "I moved back a few months ago." "Back from where?" It was a casual question on the surface, but I could hear the professional undertone. Police officers developed a sense for when something didn't quite add up, when the story they were hearing had gaps that might be worth exploring. "I've been traveling for work," I said. "Spent some time overseas." Captain Williams nodded slowly, and I could see him processing information behind eyes that had probably seen enough to develop good instincts about people. "What kind of work?" Before I could answer, Mrs. Henderson reappeared at his elbow with the persistence of someone who'd appointed herself Neighborhood Information Coordinator. "I was telling Captain Williams about our contribution tracking," she said, "making sure we acknowledge everyone who makes the community stronger." The implication was clear without being explicitly stated. I hadn't contributed, therefore I hadn't made the community stronger. Therefore, my presence was somewhat questionable. It was the kind of social mathematics that turned neighborhood gathering into subtle hierarchy enforcement. Captain Williams glanced at Mrs. Henderson with an expression that suggested he was familiar with her particular brand of community management. "I'm sure everyone contributes in their own way," he said diplomatically. "Of course," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "It's just important to recognize actual participation versus just showing up." The words hit exactly as intended. Around us, I could feel the attention of nearby tables turning our way with the magnetic pull of potential conflict. Carmen's hand found my arm under the table, a silent gesture of support and possibly restraint. I looked up at Captain Williams, who was watching the exchange with professional interest. "Mrs. Henderson's right about participation being important," I said. "Community depends on people who show up when it matters." Something in my tone made Captain Williams's expression shift, the way it does when someone hears a note they recognize but can't quite place. His eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was reevaluating everything he'd assumed about the conversation. "Have we met before?" he asked suddenly. The question came out of nowhere and hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Henderson looked between us with obvious confusion, clearly not expecting the conversation to take this particular turn. Carmen's grip on my arm tightened. "I don't think so," I said, which was technically true. We hadn't met, not in any formal sense. But Captain Williams was studying my face with the kind of methodical attention that suggested he was searching through mental files, trying to match what he was seeing with something stored in memory. Police officers and military personnel developed similar skills for remembering faces, especially faces connected to significant events. "You look familiar," he said, "very familiar." Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat with obvious impatience. "Well, perhaps you could continue catching up later. I wanted to make sure Captain Williams knew about our community participation initiative." But Captain Williams wasn't listening to her anymore. His attention was completely focused on me, and I could see the moment when the pieces started falling into place behind his eyes. Recognition, dawning like sunrise, slow at first and then sudden and complete. He took a step back, his posture changing in a way that transformed him from neighborhood police captain to something more formal, more official. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, not loudly, but with the kind of projection that cut through conversations and drew attention across the entire block party. "Could I have everyone's attention for just a moment?" The music seemed to lower by itself, though someone had probably adjusted the volume. Conversations died out in expanding circles as people turned toward the sound of authority requesting their focus.
Kids stopped running and looked around to see what the adults were doing. Even the volleyball game paused mid-serve. Mrs. Henderson looked completely bewildered, her clipboard hanging forgotten at her side. Carmen's hand was still on my arm, but now it felt more like an anchor than support. Captain Williams waited until he had complete attention, the way people do when they're about to say something important. Then he looked directly at me and said, in a voice that carried across the entire block, "General Rodriguez, thank you for your service." The effect was immediate and electric. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the flag hanging from Mr. Chen's porch snapping in the breeze 2 houses down. Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed without making sound. Carmen's grip on my arm went slack with shock. Across the crowd, I could see faces changing as they processed what they'd just heard, assumptions crumbling and rebuilding themselves in real time. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye on the block pressing against me like physical force. Captain Williams brought his hand to his forehead in a salute that was crisp and formal and held nothing back. I returned it, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. 23 years of service doesn't leave your body easily, and for a moment, I wasn't Maria Rodriguez trying to fit into a neighborhood block party. I was General Maria Rodriguez, United States Army, retired after 3 combat deployments and more missions than I could count, standing at attention in front of a man who understood exactly what those words meant.
"I apologize for not recognizing you sooner," Captain Williams said when he lowered his hand. "I should have known." "There's no reason you would have," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm not exactly in uniform." But he was shaking his head before I finished speaking. "I was deployed to Afghanistan in 2018, Forward Operating Base Chapman. You flew in for a briefing with our unit about convoy security protocols." The memory hit me like cold water. FOB Chapman, a dusty collection of tents and temporary buildings that housed Marines and Army personnel working dangerous routes through hostile territory. I'd flown in during a tour of regional bases, meeting with unit commanders about new intelligence on IED placement patterns. "3rd Marine Regiment," I said, remembering. "Captain Williams, you asked about communication protocols for mixed unit operations." His face broke into a grin that transformed him completely. "You remembered that question for 3 years?" "I remember good questions," I said simply. Around us, the block party had reorganized itself into something completely different. People were moving closer, not crowding, but creating a loose circle that suggested respectful attention rather than curious spectacle. Mrs. Henderson stood frozen at the edge of the gathering, her face cycling through emotions I couldn't quite read. Carmen found her voice first. "General," she said, and the word came out like a question and an accusation and a plea all at once. I turned to look at my sister, seeing my reflection in her shocked expression. For 7 years, I'd been Maria who traveled for work, Maria who was between jobs, Maria who didn't cook casseroles or organize block parties or contribute to community events in ways that fit neatly on clipboard lists. "I should have told you," I said. "You think?" Carmen's voice cracked somewhere between laughter and tears. "Jesus, Maria, General!" Before I could answer, Captain Williams spoke again, his voice carrying the kind of respect that made the crowd lean in to listen. "General Rodriguez commanded the 82nd Airborne's Crisis Response Unit, 3 combat deployments, led evacuation operations that saved hundreds of lives during the withdrawal from Afghanistan." He paused, looking around the circle of faces that had gathered to listen. "When we talk about people who serve the community, who show up when it matters most, who contribute in ways that can't be measured on a clipboard, this is what that looks like." Mrs. Henderson made a sound that might have been a gasp or a sob. When I looked at her, her face had gone pale and her hands were shaking slightly where they gripped her clipboard. "I didn't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "There was no way you could have known," I said, and I meant it. "I don't advertise it." "But why?" The question came from someone in the crowd, a woman I hadn't met whose voice carried genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "Why keep it quiet?" It was the question I'd been asked before, by therapists and friends and family members who couldn't understand why someone would want to hide a distinguished military career. The answer was complicated, layered with experiences that didn't translate well to civilian conversations, and decisions made in the space between who I'd been and who I was trying to become. Because I wanted to be just Maria for a while. Not General Rodriguez, not someone defined by their service record. Just a woman trying to figure out how to live in the world after spending 20 years learning how to fight for it. The silence that followed felt different from the shocked quiet that had greeted Captain Williams' announcement. This was contemplative, the kind of pause that happens when people are processing something that requires them to reconsider everything they thought they understood. Carmen moved first, closing the distance between us and wrapping me in a hug that felt like forgiveness and understanding and apology all at once. "I'm proud of you," she whispered against my ear. "I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry I didn't know how to be proud of you before." When she stepped back, Mrs. Henderson was there, her clipboard abandoned on a nearby table, her hands still shaking slightly, but her eyes clear with the kind of determination that suggested she was about to do something difficult. "General Rodriguez," she said, her voice formal but genuine, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. My behavior today was unacceptable, and I'm deeply sorry." I looked at this woman who had spent the afternoon making me feel unwelcome in my own sister's neighborhood, who had questioned my right to be there and my commitment to community. The easy thing would have been to accept her apology graciously and move on, to let the revelation of my military service serve as a shield against future judgment. "Mrs. Henderson," I said instead, "you don't owe me an apology for not knowing who I used to be. You owe me an apology for how you treated who I am." Her face crumpled slightly, understanding hitting her like a physical blow. "You're right. You're absolutely right. I made assumptions about your worth based on what I could see you contributing today, and that was wrong. It was small and petty and wrong." "Thank you," I said, because sometimes accepting an apology is its own form of service. Captain Williams stepped forward again, and I could see him transitioning back into his role as community police captain, the man who helped neighborhoods function and neighbors treat each other with respect. I think this is a good moment to remember that service comes in a lot of different forms. Military service is one kind, but so is organizing block parties and coaching Little League and checking on elderly neighbors and 1,000 other ways people show up for each other. He looked at me, then at Mrs. Henderson, then at Carmen. The best communities are built by people who understand that everyone contributes something, even if we can't always see what it is from the outside. And just like that, the crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming in smaller groups as people processed what they'd witnessed and what it meant for how they understood their own neighborhood dynamics. The volleyball game started up again. Kids went back to running around with the tireless energy that only children possess. But something had shifted, something that went beyond just the revelation of my military background. There was a different quality to the interactions now, a more careful consideration of assumptions and judgments.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Mrs. Henderson spent the rest of the afternoon making quiet apologies to people she'd probably been too rigid with in the past. Carmen moved through the crowd with a new kind of confidence, pride radiating from her in ways that had nothing to do with organizing successful community events. As the sun started to set and people began the process of cleaning up, Captain Williams found me again, this time approaching with the relaxed demeanor of someone making friendly conversation rather than official inquiries. "Can I ask you something, General?" "Just Maria," I said. "I'm retired." He smiled. "Can I ask you something, Maria? Why did you really come back here, to this neighborhood, this life?" I considered the question, watching Carmen direct the breakdown of tables and the packing up of leftover food with the same organizational skills that had made the whole event possible. "Because I spent 23 years learning how to serve something bigger than myself," I said finally. "And now I'm trying to figure out how to serve something smaller." Captain Williams nodded like that made perfect sense. "How's it going so far?" I looked around at the scene unfolding around us, Neighbors working together to restore their street to its normal, quiet residential state. Kids helping adults carry folding chairs and elderly residents offering to take home leftover desserts. Mrs. Henderson was carefully packing up her clipboard and organization materials, but now she was also asking Mr. Chen if he needed help loading the sound system into his car. "Ask me again next year," I said. As Captain Williams walked back to his patrol car, Carmen appeared at my side carrying a plate piled high with leftover desserts and an expression that suggested she had questions she was still figuring out how to ask. "So," she said finally, "General, huh?" "Yeah. Were you ever going to tell me?" I took the plate from her hands and balanced it against my hip. I was trying to figure out how to be your sister before I had to be your sister, the general. Carmen was quiet for a long moment, processing that distinction. Then she bumped my shoulder with hers, a gesture of affection and understanding that felt like coming home. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you're pretty good at both." And as we walked toward her house, carrying leftover desserts and the weight of new understanding between us, I thought maybe she was right. Maybe service really did come in all different forms, and maybe learning how to be part of a community was just another kind of mission, requiring the same dedication and patience and willingness to show up that had guided me through everything else. Mrs. Henderson was waiting by Carmen's front gate, her organizing supplies packed, but her posture suggested she had something more to say. When she saw us approaching, she straightened with the kind of resolve that suggested she'd spent the walk over preparing for a difficult conversation. "General Rodriguez," she began, then caught herself. "Maria, I wanted to speak with you before you left." I set the plate of desserts on Carmen's front steps and waited. Mrs. Henderson had spent the afternoon grappling with the discovery that her assumptions about community contribution had been not just wrong, but spectacularly misguided. This felt like a conversation that required space and attention. "I've been thinking about what Captain Williams said, about service coming in different forms and communities being built by people who show up in ways we can't always see." She paused, gathering her thoughts with the same organizational precision she'd brought to her clipboard all afternoon. "I realize I've been approaching community building like a military operation, measuring participation in ways that can be quantified and tracked. But that's not really how people work, is it? Sometimes the most important contributions are the ones that can't be put on a list," I said. Mrs. Henderson nodded, understanding flickering behind her eyes. "I'd like to ask you something, and please feel free to say no. But would you consider joining our planning committee? Not because you're a general, but because you understand things about leadership and teamwork that the rest of us could learn from." It was the last thing I'd expected her to say, and I found myself considering it more seriously than I would have that morning. "What would that involve?" "Monthly meetings, mostly just neighbors talking about how to make the street better for everyone. Snow removal coordination, organizing the annual block party, sometimes mediation when people have disputes about property lines or noise complaints." She smiled with self-awareness. "Much less dramatic than military operations, but we could probably use someone who understands how to build consensus and get people working toward common goals." I looked at Carmen, who was trying not to appear too hopeful about the prospect of her sister becoming a regular part of her neighborhood community. Then I looked back at Mrs. Henderson, seeing a woman who was genuinely trying to learn from her mistakes and build something better. "I'll think about it," I said, which was more commitment than I'd planned to offer but felt right in the moment. Mrs. Henderson's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, that's all I can ask." As she walked away, Carmen settled beside me on her front steps, both of us watching the last few neighbors finish their cleanup and head toward their own homes. The block looked peaceful in the gathering dusk, porch lights beginning to flicker on and the sound of family conversations drifting through open windows. "You know," Carmen said, "Mrs. Henderson might have a point about the planning committee thing. You want me to become a neighborhood organizer? You want me to become whatever makes you happy. But I also think you're someone who needs to be contributing to something, and maybe this could be that something." I considered it, thinking about Captain Williams' words about service coming in different forms and communities being built by people who show up in ways we can't always see. It would be different from anything I've done before. Good different or bad different? "I don't know yet," I said honestly. But maybe that's okay. Carmen leaned against my shoulder, and we sat there in comfortable silence as the neighborhood settled into evening routines around us. Somewhere down the block, I could hear kids being called in for dinner and the distant sound of someone starting up a lawnmower for one last trim before dark. "Thank you for coming today," Carmen said finally. "Even when it got weird with Mrs. Henderson, even when Captain Williams put you on the spot."
Thank you for staying. Thank you for wanting me here, I said, even when you didn't know the whole story. And as the first stars began to appear overhead, I thought about what it meant to serve something smaller than yourself, about the difference between leading troops through combat zones and helping neighbors organize block parties. Different scales, different stakes, but maybe requiring the same fundamental commitment to showing up and doing the work that kept communities functioning. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was right about needing people who understood leadership and teamwork. Maybe Carmen was right about me needing to contribute to something. Maybe Captain Williams was right about service coming in different forms. Maybe this was what coming home actually looked like. Not a destination, but a decision, made new each day, to be part of something larger than yourself, while remaining fundamentally, simply, human. 3 weeks after the block party, Carmen called me with excitement threading through her voice like electricity through copper wire. I was in my apartment, sitting at the small dining table that doubled as a desk, working through a stack of paperwork from the Veterans Administration that seemed to multiply every time I looked away from it. "Maria, you have to see this," she said without preamble. "Mrs. Henderson just dropped off a letter for you, hand-delivered, with a wax seal." I set down my pen and rubbed my eyes. The VA paperwork was giving me a headache, all forms requesting information I'd already provided twice, and explanations for benefits I wasn't sure I wanted to claim. A wax seal? What is this, the 18th century? "I'm serious. She said it was official neighborhood business and that I should make sure you got it today." She looked nervous, like she was delivering state secrets. An hour later, I was sitting in Carmen's kitchen while she hovered nearby, clearly dying to know what was in the envelope, but trying to respect my privacy. The letter was indeed sealed with red wax, pressed with what looked like an official stamp, bearing the words Maple Street Community Association. Inside, written on cream-colored paper in Mrs. Henderson's precise handwriting, was a formal invitation to attend the monthly planning committee meeting, along with a detailed agenda and what appeared to be meeting minutes from the previous 6 months. At the bottom, in smaller script, was a personal note. "I hope you'll consider this. We need someone who understands that leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room." "Well?" Carmen asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. I handed her the letter and watched her face change as she read it. "She's really serious about this committee thing." "Looks like it." Carmen set the letter down carefully, treating it with the respect Mrs. Henderson had clearly intended. "What are you going to do?" That was the question I'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. Since the block party, my routine had shifted in small but noticeable ways. I'd started taking walks through the neighborhood in the evenings, learning the rhythm of the streets and the patterns of the people who lived there. Mr. Chen always worked in his garden around 6 p.m., meticulously tending to tomato plants that looked like they belonged in a magazine. The Washington family had teenage kids who practiced basketball in their driveway until the mosquitoes drove them inside. Mrs. Patterson, 2 houses from Carmen, had mobility issues and struggled with her trash cans on collection days. These weren't observations I'd made deliberately. They were just the natural result of paying attention, the same way I'd learned to read the terrain and population patterns in every place I'd ever been deployed. The difference was that this time, I wasn't gathering intelligence for tactical planning. I was just learning how to be a neighbor. "I think I'm going to go," I said finally. Carmen's face lit up with the kind of joy that made me remember why I'd missed having family nearby. "Really? You're going to join the committee?" "I'm going to attend one meeting and see what it's about. That's not the same thing as joining." But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to both of us. Something about Mrs. Henderson's note, about her recognition that leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, had touched something I thought I'd left behind with my uniform. The truth was, I missed having a mission. I missed being part of something that required planning and coordination and the kind of quiet competence that got things done without fanfare. 2 nights later, I found myself standing outside the community center on Oak Street.
a low brick building that housed everything from senior citizen programs to youth basketball leagues. The planning committee met in a conference room that smelled like coffee and copy machine toner, furnished with folding chairs arranged around a table that had seen better decades. Mrs. Henderson was already there when I arrived, organizing papers with the same precision she'd brought to her clipboard at the block party. She looked up when I entered, and I saw relief across her face before she could mask it with professional courtesy. "General Rodriguez, thank you for coming." "Just Maria," I reminded her, taking a seat across the table. "I'm here as a neighbor, not as a former officer." "Of course, Maria." She said my name carefully, like she was trying to reprogram years of military courtesy. "The others should be here shortly." The others turned out to be a mixed group of longtime residents and newer neighbors, ranging from young parents to retirees who'd lived on Maple Street since the houses were first built. Tom Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's son, who managed a local bank, served as treasurer and brought the kind of methodical attention to detail that probably served him well in finance. Sarah Kim, a teacher at the elementary school 3 blocks over, handled communications and had the organized efficiency of someone used to managing classroom chaos. David O'Coffer, a software engineer who worked remotely, managed their nascent social media presence and brought a younger perspective to neighborhood concerns. The agenda Mrs. Henderson had included with her letter turned out to be optimistic. What followed was an hour and a half of well-intentioned people talking past each other about issues that seemed both urgent and completely mundane. The street light at the corner of Maple and Elm had been flickering for 2 months, but nobody could figure out which city department handled repairs. The annual Halloween party needed a new location because the community center had doubled their rental fees. Someone's dog was getting loose regularly and leaving surprises on other people's lawns, but approaching the owner required diplomatic skills nobody felt confident deploying. I listened without commenting, taking mental notes about group dynamics and communication patterns.
Henderson tried to maintain order, but she approached it like military logistics rather than civilian consensus building. When people disagreed, she'd cite precedent and policy instead of finding common ground. When discussions wandered, she'd redirect with authority rather than guidance. It was effective up to a point, but I could see frustration building in the way people's voices got tighter and their suggestions became more tentative. "Maybe we should table the Halloween discussion until next month," Mrs. Henderson said, when the debate about locations had circled back to the same 3 options for the 4th time. "We're not making progress, and we have other items to cover." David Okafor leaned back in his chair with obvious disappointment. "We've been tabling it for 3 months. Halloween is 6 weeks away. If we don't decide tonight, we're going to end up canceling the whole thing." "Which might not be the worst outcome," Tom Patterson muttered. "Last year's party cost more than our entire winter snow removal budget." Sarah Kim jumped in before the discussion could devolve into an argument about fiscal priorities. "The kids look forward to it all year. We can't just cancel because we're having trouble with logistics." Mrs. Henderson looked around the table with the expression of someone trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away from her. "Does anyone have any new suggestions for venues?" Silence stretched across the room like a held breath. I could see each person mentally running through the same options they'd already discussed, coming up with the same limitations and concerns that had stalled the conversation in the first place. "What if we're thinking about this wrong?" I said quietly. Every head turned toward me. I'd been so quiet during the meeting that I think some of them had forgotten I was there. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Henderson asked. I leaned forward slightly, falling into the rhythm of tactical planning without consciously deciding to do it. "You're trying to find a single location that meets all your requirements and fits your budget. But what if instead of one big event, you created multiple smaller ones? Different houses hosting different activities, kids moving from station to station through the neighborhood." Sarah Kim's eyes lit up with understanding. "Like a progressive party, but for Halloween." "Exactly. Distribute the cost, distribute the work, distribute the impact. Instead of trying to find one perfect space, you use the whole neighborhood as your venue." Tom Patterson was already pulling out his phone, probably doing quick mental math. "That could actually work budget-wise. Instead of one big rental and catering expense, we'd have multiple families covering smaller costs."
David Okafor nodded enthusiastically. And it would be more engaging for the kids. Instead of standing around in one room, they'd be moving around, seeing different houses, probably getting more social interaction. Mrs. Henderson was taking notes, but I could see her processing the logistics with the same systematic thinking she brought to everything else. We'd need coordination between the host families, communication protocols, timing schedules to prevent bottlenecks. Those are all solvable problems, I said. The question is whether people would be willing to participate. Sarah Kim was already mentally volunteering. My family would host a station. We've got a big front yard and my kids would love being part of the organizing. Over the next 20 minutes, what had been a stalled discussion became an energetic planning session. Tom Patterson offered to handle financial coordination between families. David Okafor suggested creating a simple app to help kids track which stations they'd visited. Mrs. Henderson mapped out timing logistics with the precision of someone planning a military operation, but now she was working with the group's energy instead of against their frustration. By the time the meeting ended, they'd outlined a plan that was both more ambitious and more achievable than their original concept. More importantly, they'd done it through collaboration rather than compromise, finding a solution that excited everyone instead of disappointing no one. As people gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson approached me with the careful demeanor of someone about to make an important request. "Maria, would you consider accepting a formal position on the committee? What you did tonight, the way you helped us think through the Halloween problem, that's exactly the kind of leadership we need." I looked around the room at these people who were trying to build something meaningful in their small corner of the world. 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Henderson had questioned my right to attend a block party without bringing a casserole. Now she was asking me to help lead their community initiatives. The change wasn't just about learning my military background. It was about seeing a different kind of contribution, understanding that leadership could look like listening and redirecting rather than commanding and controlling. What would that involve? Co-chair with me initially, help with strategic planning, conflict resolution when neighbors disagree about things, coordination with city services when we need to interface with bureaucracy. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. Help me become a better leader for this group. That last part surprised me. Mrs. Henderson had run these meetings with military efficiency, but she was asking for help, recognizing that efficiency wasn't the same thing as effectiveness. "I'll try it for 6 months. See how it goes." The relief on her face was immediate and genuine. "Thank you. I think this could be really good for the neighborhood." As I walked home through the quiet streets, I found myself thinking about the difference between command and leadership. In the military, authority was clearly defined and largely unquestioned. Orders flowed down through established hierarchies, and success was measured by mission completion and troop welfare. Civilian leadership, especially at the neighborhood level, required different skills entirely. Consensus building instead of order giving, influence instead of authority, patience instead of urgency. 3 days later, Sarah Kim called me with excitement and panic in equal measure. "Maria, we have a problem with the Halloween plan." Well, not a problem exactly, but a complication. I was at Carmen's house, helping her paint her guest bedroom a shade of blue that she'd changed her mind about twice since starting the project. Carmen paused with her roller halfway up the wall, clearly interested in whatever neighborhood drama was about to unfold. "What kind of complication?" "Mrs. Patterson called this morning. She loves the Progressive Party idea, but she's worried about her mobility issues. She wants to participate, but doesn't think she can handle hosting a station that requires a lot of setup or supervision." I set down my paintbrush and considered the problem. Mrs. Patterson lived alone since her husband's death 2 years earlier, and I'd noticed during my evening walks that she struggled with physical tasks that required lifting or sustained standing. But she'd been part of the neighborhood longer than almost anyone else, and excluding her from the Halloween event would send exactly the wrong message about community building. "What did you tell her?" "That we'd figure something out, but honestly, I'm not sure what the solution is. The activities we planned all require active supervision, and if we make exceptions for one person, other families might feel like they're being asked to do more than their fair share." This was exactly the kind of challenge that could derail a community initiative before it got started. Not a big dramatic conflict, but a smaller equity issue that touched on questions of inclusion and fairness that didn't have easy answers. "Can I call Mrs. Patterson directly?" I asked. "Of course, but Maria, be careful how you approach it. She's proud, and she doesn't like feeling like she's being accommodated." An hour later, I was sitting in Mrs. Patterson's living room, drinking tea from delicate china cups that probably predated my birth, and listening to her explain why she felt conflicted about the Halloween event. "I want to be part of it," she said, her voice carrying the strength that had probably gotten her through decades of raising children and managing a household, and eventually caring for a sick husband. "This neighborhood has been my home for 37 years. I've watched kids grow up, seen families come and go, been through storms and celebrations with these people. But I also don't want to be the reason the whole thing doesn't work." Mrs. Patterson was in her mid-70s, with silver hair she still styled carefully every morning, and clothes that suggested she'd never quite adjusted to the casual dress codes of modern life. Her house was immaculate, filled with photographs spanning decades and furniture that had been chosen for durability rather than trends. She moved carefully but deliberately, someone who'd adapted to physical limitations without surrendering to them. "What if we designed a station specifically around your strengths instead of trying to work around your limitations?" I asked. She raised an eyebrow with the skeptical expression of someone who'd heard a lot of well-meaning suggestions over the years. "Such as? You've lived here longer than anyone else. You know stories about every house, every family, probably every tree on the block. What if your station was neighborhood history? Kids could come to your house and learn about what this place was like when their parents were young, or hear stories about families who used to live in their houses." Mrs. Patterson set down her teacup with the careful precision of someone who'd been serving tea properly for longer than I'd been alive. "You think children would be interested in hearing an old woman tell stories? I think kids love stories, especially stories about places they know. And I think you probably have stories that would surprise them." For the next hour, Mrs. Patterson told me stories that revealed layers of neighborhood history I'd never suspected. The house where David O'Coffer now worked on software projects once belonged to a family that raised racing pigeons in their backyard. The corner lot that was now a small park had been the site of a pharmacy that served as an unofficial community center during the 1970s. Carmen's house, our grandmother's house, had been home to a woman who'd hidden Jewish refugees during World War II before immigrating to America herself. "These stories need to be preserved," I said, when she finished recounting the tale of how Mr. Chen's property had once housed a victory garden that fed half the block during wartime rationing. "Not just for Halloween, but permanently." Mrs. Patterson looked surprised. "You really think they're worth preserving?" "I think they're the foundation of what makes this neighborhood a community instead of just a collection of houses." When I left Mrs. Patterson's house an hour later, we'd outlined plans not just for a Halloween history station, but for a broader neighborhood oral history project that could capture stories before they were lost. Mrs. Patterson would interview longtime residents, Sarah Kim could help organize the materials for educational purposes, and David O'Coffer could create a digital archive that would be accessible to current and future neighbors. The Halloween event, originally planned as a one-night party, was evolving into something that could strengthen community connections year-round. Not because anyone had mandated it, but because we'd started with inclusion and collaboration instead of logistics and limitations. 2 weeks later, I was back in the community center conference room, but this time the energy was completely different. Instead of one person trying to maintain order while others talked past each other, the planning committee had become a coordinated team working toward shared goals. Mrs. Henderson had adapted her organizational skills to group facilitation, creating structures that supported collaboration rather than controlling it. Tom Patterson had developed a budget framework that distributed costs fairly while maintaining financial transparency. Sarah Kim had recruited volunteer families and coordinated communication with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed bringing people together. David O'Coffer had created simple digital tools that made coordination easier without requiring technical expertise from participants. "The History Station is getting more interest than we expected," Sarah reported during the Halloween planning update. "Mrs. Patterson has 3 families signed up to help with setup, and 2 other longtime residents want to contribute stories." Mrs. Henderson consulted her notes with the satisfaction of someone whose organizational systems were finally working as intended. "That brings us to 8 confirmed stations, which means we can accommodate about 40 kids without anyone feeling rushed." "What about weather contingency plans?" Tom asked, displaying the cautious thinking that probably made him good at managing other people's money. "Each station has an indoor backup option," I said.
We surveyed all the host families about space limitations and alternative setups. If it rains, kids can still visit every station, just with modified activities. David looked up from his laptop, where he'd been updating the coordination app in real time. "I've got digital maps ready to send to participating families, showing the route and timing for optimal flow. Kids can start at any station and move in either direction around the loop." It was exactly the kind of thorough planning that would have made any military logistics officer proud, but it had emerged from civilian collaboration rather than top-down command. Everyone had contributed expertise, everyone had taken ownership of specific pieces, and everyone understood how their part connected to the larger success. "There's one more thing we should discuss," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone shifting to something more serious. "This Halloween event has generated a lot of positive response, but it's also raised questions about other neighborhood initiatives. Several families have asked whether we're planning similar collaborative approaches for other issues." She was right. Over the past month, I'd had neighbors approach me with ideas and concerns that went well beyond Halloween party planning. The flickering streetlight that had been ignored for months suddenly had 3 families researching city maintenance procedures. The loose dog problem had been resolved through a combination of diplomatic conversation and practical solutions involving better fencing. 2 families had started informal babysitting exchanges that were already reducing childcare stress for working parents. "What kind of questions?" I asked. "Whether we're going to tackle the traffic speed problem on Elm Street, whether we can organize group purchasing for snow removal services, whether we want to start a neighborhood watch program." Mrs. Henderson paused, looking around the table. "People are starting to see what's possible when neighbors work together systematically instead of just hoping problems resolve themselves." This was the moment I'd been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. The Halloween event had been a bounded project, with clear goals and defined endpoints. What Mrs. Henderson was describing sounded like the beginning of serious community organizing, the kind of sustained commitment that would require ongoing leadership and continuous engagement. "What do you think, Maria?" Sarah asked. "You've gotten us this far. Are you willing to help us think bigger?" I looked around the table at these people who'd become partners rather than just neighbors, who'd learned to channel their good intentions through effective planning and collaborative action. 6 months ago, I'd been trying to figure out how to live in the world after 2 decades of military service. Now I was being asked to help lead a community organizing effort that could transform how an entire neighborhood functioned. "I think," I said slowly, "we need to be very careful about taking on more than we can handle effectively. But I also think you're right that this neighborhood has potential that isn't being realized." Tom Patterson leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd been thinking about these questions beyond the scope of Halloween planning. "What would it look like to do this systematically, not just reacting to problems as they come up, but actually building infrastructure for ongoing community improvement?" It was a good question, the kind that required strategic thinking about resources and sustainability, and the difference between enthusiastic volunteerism and sustainable civic engagement. It would mean establishing clear governance structures, reliable communication systems, and fair distribution of leadership responsibilities, I said. It would mean creating processes that could continue working even when specific people moved away or lost interest. David was already taking notes, his software engineer mind
probably organizing the challenges into manageable components. That sounds complicated, but not impossible, like building any other kind of sustainable system. Mrs. Henderson was nodding with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found a framework that matched her organizational instincts. We'd need to research how other neighborhoods have approached similar initiatives, find models that have worked long-term. And we'd need buy-in from a much larger percentage of residents, Sarah added. Halloween party participation is one thing. Ongoing civic engagement is something else entirely. These were all valid concerns, the kind of practical considerations that determined whether community organizing efforts succeeded or burned out within a year. But sitting in that room, listening to people talk about what they wanted to build together, I felt something I hadn't experienced since retiring from active duty. Purpose that extended beyond personal satisfaction. Work that mattered to people I cared about. The opportunity to use skills I'd developed in service of something immediately meaningful. I think, I said slowly, we need to be very careful about taking on more than we can handle effectively. But I also think you're right that this neighborhood has potential that isn't being realized. Tom Patterson leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd been thinking about these questions beyond the scope of Halloween planning. What would it look like to do this systematically? Not just reacting to problems as they come up, but actually building infrastructure for ongoing community improvement. It was a good question, the kind that required strategic thinking about resources and sustainability, and the difference between enthusiastic volunteerism and sustainable civic engagement. It would mean establishing clear governance structures, reliable communication systems, and fair distribution of leadership responsibilities, I said. It would mean creating processes that could continue working even when specific people moved away or lost interest. David was already taking notes, his software engineer mind probably organizing the challenges into manageable components. That sounds complicated, but not impossible, like building any other kind of sustainable system. Mrs. Henderson was nodding with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found a framework that matched her organizational instincts. We'd need to research how other neighborhoods have approached similar initiatives, find models that have worked long-term. And we'd need buy-in from a much larger percentage of residents, Sarah added. Halloween party participation is one thing. Ongoing civic engagement is something else entirely. These were all valid concerns, the kind of practical considerations that determined whether community organizing efforts succeeded or burned out within a year. But sitting in that room, listening to people talk about what they wanted to build together, I felt something I hadn't experienced since retiring from active duty. Purpose that extended beyond personal satisfaction. Work that mattered to people I cared about. The opportunity to use skills I developed in service of something immediately meaningful. I'll commit to 6 more months, help you research models, develop sustainable structures, and build broader community engagement. After that, we evaluate whether it's working and whether I'm still the right person to be involved. Mrs. Henderson's relief was immediate and obvious. Thank you. I think this could be really important for the neighborhood. As the meeting wrapped up and people gathered their materials, I realized something fundamental had shifted in how I understood my place in this community. 3 months ago, I'd been Carmen's sister, who didn't bring casseroles to block parties. 6 weeks ago, I'd been the retired general whose military service had been revealed during a moment of social tension. Tonight, I was simply Maria Rodriguez, co-chair of a planning committee that was helping neighbors build something meaningful together. The change wasn't just about how others saw me, it was about how I saw myself, and what I'd learned about the difference between earning respect through past accomplishments and earning trust through present contributions. Walking home through the quiet streets, I noticed things I'd missed during my earlier evening walks. Porch lights that had been repaired, front yards that showed signs of increased care and attention, small improvements that suggested people were taking more pride in their shared space, investing more energy in the place they all called home. These weren't dramatic transformations, just subtle shifts in how people related to their physical environment and each other. but they were exactly the kind of changes that accumulated over time into stronger communities, the kind of incremental progress that created foundation for larger improvements. When I reached Carmen's house, I found her sitting on her front steps with a cup of tea, enjoying the mild evening air and the kind of peaceful neighborhood atmosphere that made suburban life appealing. "How was the meeting?" she asked as I settled beside her. "Productive. We're thinking about expanding beyond Halloween planning." Carmen raised her eyebrow with the expression of someone who knew me well enough to recognize when I was understating something significant. "Expanding how?" I told her about the conversation, about the questions Mrs. Henderson had raised, and the possibilities the committee was considering.
Carmen listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that community organizing could become either deeply rewarding or completely overwhelming, depending on how it was approached. "Are you sure you want to take on something that big?" she asked when I finished explaining. "You just figured out how to be a neighbor. Community organizing is a whole different level of commitment." It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself throughout the evening. Military service had taught me to be cautious about mission creep, about allowing good intentions to expand beyond available resources or sustainable timelines. But it had also taught me to recognize when strategic opportunities aligned with available capabilities and meaningful objectives. "I think this neighborhood has people who are ready to do the work," I said. "They just need someone to help them organize their efforts effectively." Carmen was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what I was describing. "And you think you're that someone?" "I think I could be. For a while." I leaned back against the porch railing, looking out at the street where we'd both grown up, where our grandmother had raised her children and built relationships that lasted decades. I've spent 23 years learning how to build teams and coordinate complex operations. Maybe it's time to use those skills for something that doesn't require anyone to carry weapons. Carmen laughed, but it was warm rather than mocking. "Only you would describe neighborhood organizing as a military operation." "Good organizing is good organizing," I said. "Whether you're coordinating humanitarian relief or planning Halloween parties, the principles are the same." As if to prove my point, Mrs. Henderson appeared at the end of Carmen's walkway, moving with purposeful determination and carrying what appeared to be another formally sealed envelope. "I'm sorry to bother you at home," she said as she approached, "but I wanted to get this to you tonight while the ideas were still fresh." The envelope contained a 3-page proposal, handwritten in Mrs. Henderson's precise script, outlining a framework for what she'd titled Maple Street Community Initiative. It included organizational structure, meeting schedules, communication protocols, and preliminary research into successful neighborhood organizing models from other cities. "You wrote this tonight?" I asked, impressed despite myself by the thoroughness of the proposal. "I started it during the meeting," Mrs. Henderson admitted. "I've been thinking about these ideas for months, but I didn't know how to make them practical until tonight's discussion gave me a framework." Carmen read over my shoulder, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or approval. "This is really comprehensive," she said. "You've thought through everything from leadership rotation to conflict resolution procedures." Mrs. Henderson's face flushed with pleasure at the recognition. "I may have gotten carried away with the planning, but I think the framework is sound. What do you think, Maria?" I studied the proposal, noting the careful attention to sustainability and inclusion, the realistic timelines for implementation, and the built-in evaluation mechanisms that would allow the initiative to evolve based on results rather than assumptions. "I think you've created something that could actually work long-term," I said. "This isn't just enthusiastic volunteering. This is serious civic infrastructure." "Does that mean you'll help me implement it?" Looking at Mrs. Henderson's hopeful expression, at Carmen's encouraging smile, at the detailed proposal that represented hours of careful thought and genuine commitment to community improvement, I felt the familiar weight of accepting responsibility for something larger than personal interest. "Yes," I said. "Let's build something that lasts." 6 months later, I stood in the renovated community center basement, watching 43 neighbors debate snow removal strategies with the kind of passionate intensity usually reserved for matters of national security. The Maple Street Community Initiative had grown from Mrs. Henderson's handwritten proposal into something neither of us had quite anticipated, a functioning model of grassroots democracy that other neighborhoods were starting to ask about. The basement smelled like fresh paint and coffee,
furnished now with donated tables arranged in a large circle instead of the old hierarchical setup that had made half the room feel like spectators. Someone had hung maps of the neighborhood on the walls, marked with colored pins indicating everything from street repair needs to families with elderly residents who might need assistance during emergencies. A whiteboard covered one entire wall, filled with action items and timeline charts that would have made any project manager proud. The problem with individual snow removal contracts is cost efficiency, but the problem with group contracts is coordination complexity. David O'Coffer leaned forward from his seat near the technology station he had set up to manage digital communication and documentation. What if we did both? Group contract for main streets and shared spaces, individual arrangements for driveways and walkways. Margaret Chen, Mr. Chen's daughter-in-law who'd moved to the neighborhood over the summer, raised her hand with the careful politeness of someone still learning group dynamics. Would that create equity issues for families with different financial situations? It was exactly the kind of thoughtful question that had become characteristic of these meetings. Over the past 6 months, the community initiative had attracted people who approached neighborhood issues with genuine care and systematic thinking. Not just the usual suspects who showed up to complain about problems, but neighbors who came ready to research solutions and commit time to implementation. Mrs. Henderson, who now served as facilitating coordinator while I handled strategic planning, made notes on her tablet with the digital efficiency she'd embraced after realizing that handwritten minutes weren't sustainable for a group this size. Margaret raises an important point about economic inclusion. Should we research sliding scale options for the group contract? Sarah Kim nodded enthusiastically. I can contact the 3 vendors we're considering and ask for flexible payment structures. Most local businesses want to maintain good community relationships. This was how problems got solved now in our corner of the world. Someone identified an issue, multiple people contributed research and expertise, the group developed solutions that balanced practical constraints with shared values, and implementation happened through coordinated volunteer effort. Not perfect, not always efficient, but consistently effective in ways that surprised even me. The snow removal debate continued for another 20 minutes before reaching consensus on a hybrid approach that satisfied both budget concerns and equity principles. Then the group moved on to street lighting improvements, Halloween event evaluation, and preliminary planning for a neighborhood emergency preparedness program that Captain Williams had suggested after attending one of our meetings as a community resource. I found myself in the familiar role of tactical advisor, helping people think through logistics and potential complications without taking over decision-making processes. It was a delicate balance that had taken months to calibrate, learning how to contribute military-trained strategic thinking to civilian collaborative processes without overwhelming the democratic elements that made the initiative sustainable. Maria, what do you think about the emergency preparedness timeline? Mrs. Henderson asked, pulling me back into the immediate discussion. I looked at the proposed schedule David had outlined on his laptop, noting the ambitious scope and the assumption that volunteer coordination would remain consistent over a 6-month implementation period. I think you're underestimating the complexity of emergency communication systems and overestimating how much sustained attention people can maintain for preparedness activities that aren't immediately necessary.
Tom Patterson looked up from his budget calculations. Too ambitious? Not too ambitious, but maybe sequenced wrong. Start with simple inventory and contact information. Build trust and habits around basic preparedness, then expand to more complex coordination systems. Margaret Chen was taking notes with the focused attention of someone who'd become the group's unofficial documentation specialist. Like building foundation before adding advanced features? Exactly. People need to experience success with simple systems before they'll invest energy in complicated ones. This kind of conversation had become routine over the months, neighbors learning to apply systematic thinking to community challenges while I learned to translate military planning concepts into civilian organizing language. The result was an approach to neighborhood improvement that combined strategic thinking with democratic participation in ways that worked better than either approach would have alone. After the meeting ended and people dispersed to their evening routines, Mrs. Henderson lingered to help with cleanup and the kind of informal debriefing that had become our weekly tradition. She'd evolved over the months from authoritarian organizer to collaborative facilitator, learning to channel her natural organizational skills through group processes rather than individual control. 43 people, she said as we stacked chairs and gathered materials. When we started, I thought 12 people constituting a functional committee would be ambitious.
I wiped down the whiteboard, erasing action items that had been completed and updating timelines that needed adjustment. Growth is good, but we need to be careful about maintaining effectiveness as the group gets larger. You think we're getting too big? It was a question I'd been considering for weeks as attendance at meetings steadily increased and the scope of community projects expanded beyond anything we'd originally envisioned. More participation meant more energy and resources, but it also meant more complex coordination and higher potential for conflict between different priorities and approaches. I think we're approaching a transition point, I said. The informal coordination that worked for 20 people isn't going to work for 40. We need to decide whether we want to formalize leadership structures or split into smaller working groups. Mrs. Henderson nodded thoughtfully, understanding immediately what I was suggesting. You're talking about the difference between a large committee and an actual organization. Exactly. Both are valid approaches, but they require different kinds of leadership and different expectations for participant commitment. We finished cleaning in comfortable silence, both of us processing the implications of what the community initiative had become and what it might need to become next. 6 months ago, we'd been planning a Halloween party. Now we were managing multiple ongoing projects, coordinating with city services, and fielding inquiries from other neighborhoods about replicating our organizing model. Success, it turned out, created its own challenges. The next morning, I was sitting in my apartment kitchen with coffee and the newspaper when Carmen called with excitement and concern blending in her voice like oil and water trying to mix. "Maria, did you see the article in today's Metro section?" I flipped through the paper until I found the piece she was referring to, a half-page feature titled "Neighborhood Initiative Becomes Model for Grassroots Democracy." The article described the Maple Street Community Initiative as an example of effective citizen organizing, complete with quotes from city council members and a photograph of our most recent meeting that someone had apparently taken without my noticing. "How did they even find out about us?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "David posted about the emergency preparedness program on social media, and it got shared by the police department's community outreach coordinator. A reporter saw it and started asking questions." I read through the article, noting the generally positive tone, but also the way it focused on the unusual effectiveness of our organizing rather than the routine nature of neighbors working together to solve common problems. The reporter had clearly been impressed by our systematic approach and documented results, but the article made it sound like we'd accomplished something extraordinary rather than simply functional. "They quoted you," Carmen said, "right there in the third paragraph." I found the quote. "Maria Rodriguez, co-chair of the initiative and retired Army general, attributes the group's success to treating community organizing like any other complex operation that requires clear objectives, coordinated resources, and sustained commitment." It was accurate, but felt strange to see my words presented as expert commentary on civilian organizing when I was still learning how to be an effective neighbor myself. "I didn't realize they were interviewing me for a newspaper article," I said. "I thought the reporter was just curious about our process." "Well, now everyone knows about it. Mrs. Henderson already called me this morning. She's excited about the recognition but worried about what happens if other neighborhoods start asking for help replicating the model." It was a valid concern. The article presented our initiative as a replicable solution to common neighborhood problems, but replication required resources and expertise that we developed through months of trial and error. We couldn't just hand someone a manual and expect them to achieve similar results without understanding the specific conditions and relationships that had made our approach successful. 2 hours later, Mrs. Henderson was at my door with a folder full of printed emails and the expression of someone who'd been overwhelmed by unexpected attention. "We've received 17 inquiries since the article was published this morning," she said, settling into my living room chair with the careful movements of someone carrying stress in her shoulders. "Neighborhood associations, community groups, even a city council member asking if we'd present our model at a municipal meeting." I poured coffee and considered the implications of what she was describing. Recognition was gratifying, but it also created pressures and expectations that could distract from the actual work of community organizing. What kinds of inquiries? Requests for consultations, invitations to speak at other neighborhood meetings, questions about whether we offer training or technical assistance? She paused, looking through the emails with obvious uncertainty. "A few people are asking if you specifically would be willing to help them start similar initiatives." This was the complication I'd been anticipating without quite knowing how to prepare for it. Military service had taught me to be wary of mission creep, of allowing success in one area to create commitments that exceeded available resources or core expertise. Community organizing was still new to me, still something I was learning through direct experience rather than established knowledge. "What do you think we should do?" Mrs. Henderson set down her coffee cup with the careful precision that marked all her movements. "My gut tells me that we've learned things that could help other neighborhoods, but we've learned them through specific experiences that might not translate directly to different communities." "And?" and that maybe the most useful thing we could share isn't our specific solutions, but our approach to collaborative problem-solving. I nodded, understanding what she was suggesting. We couldn't export the Maple Street Community Initiative to other neighborhoods, but we might be able to help other groups develop their own approaches to systematic community organizing. That would mean developing educational materials, workshop formats, consultation processes. It would be a significant expansion of what we're doing.
I know, which is why I think we need to discuss it with the full group before making any commitments. Over the next week, the attention generated by the newspaper article continued to grow in ways that felt both gratifying and overwhelming. The City Council invited us to present at their next public meeting. A local nonprofit focused on civic engagement asked we participate in a panel discussion about grassroots democracy. 3 other neighborhood associations requested consultations about implementing similar initiatives. Most surprisingly, Captain Williams contacted me directly to ask if I'd consider joining a regional working group focused on community policing and civilian collaboration. He'd apparently been following our initiative since the block party incident and believed our organizing model could strengthen police-community relationships in other areas. "The thing is," he said when we met for coffee at a diner near the police station, "most community engagement efforts focus on either law enforcement needs or civilian concerns, but not both simultaneously. What you've built on Maple Street demonstrates how systematic organizing can address shared interests without anyone having to compromise their priorities." I stirred sugar into my coffee and considered what he was suggesting. "You think police departments could learn something from neighborhood organizing?" "I think police departments and communities could both benefit from more effective collaboration, and that requires the kind of structured approach you've developed." He leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd been thinking about these issues for more than just casual professional interest. "Most community policing efforts fail because they're based on good intentions rather than systematic coordination. People show up to meetings, express concerns, and then nothing sustainable gets built." It was an interesting perspective, and one that aligned with what I'd observed about the difference between functional organizing and well-meaning volunteerism. What would regional involvement look like? Monthly meetings with community organizers and law enforcement representatives from 6 surrounding jurisdictions. Focus on developing collaboration models that could be adapted to different communities and different public safety challenges. The opportunity was appealing in ways that surprised me. Police departments were hierarchical organizations that operated through clear command structures and systematic procedures, similar enough to military culture that I could probably contribute effectively without extensive learning curves. But they also served civilian populations with diverse needs and priorities, requiring the kind of collaborative approaches I'd been developing through neighborhood organizing. "I'd need to discuss it with my community initiative group," I said. "Regional involvement would affect the time and attention I can devote to local projects." Captain Williams nodded with understanding. "Of course. But think about the potential impact. If what you've built on Maple Street could be adapted to strengthen police-community relationships across the region, that could benefit thousands of families." After our meeting, I walked through downtown for an hour, processing the conversation and its implications for both personal priorities and community commitments. 6 months ago, I'd been struggling to figure out how to live as a civilian after 2 decades of military service. Now I was being asked to help bridge the gap between institutional authority and community organizing across multiple jurisdictions. The opportunity represented exactly the kind of meaningful work I'd been seeking, the chance to use skills developed through military service in ways that strengthened civilian democratic processes. But it also meant accepting responsibility for initiatives beyond my direct community, expanding my commitment from local organizing to regional collaboration. That evening, I called an emergency meeting of our core planning group to discuss the various opportunities and requests we'd received since the newspaper article. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah Kim, Tom Patterson, David Akofer, and Margaret Chen gathered in Carmen's living room with coffee and the kind of serious attention that marked conversations about significant decisions. "The fundamental question," I said after outlining the various invitations and opportunities, "is whether we want to maintain focus on local organizing or expand to serve as a resource for other communities." Sarah Kim, who'd been taking notes throughout my summary, looked up with thoughtful concern. "Both approaches have value, but they require different kinds of commitment and expertise." Tom Patterson was already calculating resource implications with the systematic thinking that made him an effective treasurer. "Regional involvement would mean travel time,
Preparation for presentations, follow-up consultation, that's significant time away from local projects. David Okofer had been quiet throughout the discussion, but now he leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd been processing technical challenges. What if we approached it systematically? Document our processes, create educational materials that other groups could adapt, maybe develop online resources instead of trying to provide direct consultation. It was a thoughtful suggestion, one that could allow us to share what we'd learned without overcommitting to individual consultation requests that might not be sustainable long-term. Margaret Chen, who'd become increasingly confident about contributing to group discussions, raised a concern that had been troubling me as well. Are we sure we've been successful enough to teach other people? We've been doing this for 6 months. Shouldn't we wait until we have more experience before trying to help other communities? Mrs. Henderson set down her teacup with the decisive gesture that marked her transitions from discussion to conclusion. Margaret raises an important point about expertise and experience, but I think we also need to consider whether we have an obligation to share what we've learned, even if we're still learning ourselves. What do you mean? I mean that systematic approaches to community organizing aren't common, and if we've developed methods that work, maybe we should make them available to other neighborhoods that are struggling with similar challenges. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical considerations about time management and resource allocation, alongside philosophical questions about community responsibility and the ethics of sharing expertise while still developing it. Eventually, we reached consensus on an approach that balanced local commitment with regional contribution. We would develop educational materials and online resources that other communities could access independently. We would accept invitations to present our model at conferences and meetings, but limit direct consultations to groups that demonstrated serious commitment to systematic organizing. And we would participate in regional collaboration initiatives like Captain Williams' Working Group, but only if local organizing remained our primary focus. Most importantly, any regional activities would be shared responsibilities rather than individual commitments. If I joined the Police Community Collaboration Working Group, other core members would participate in developing materials and workshops. If we accepted speaking invitations, presentations would represent group expertise rather than individual authority. The goal, Mrs. Henderson summarized as we prepared to adjourn, is to strengthen community organizing broadly without weakening what we've built locally. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a conference room at police headquarters, surrounded by community organizers and law enforcement representatives from 6 jurisdictions, participating in the first meeting of what Captain Williams had titled the Regional Community Collaboration Initiative. The other participants included neighborhood association leaders, nonprofit directors, police captains and lieutenants, and a few people like me whose backgrounds bridged military service and civilian organizing. The conversation was cautious at first, marked by the careful politeness that characterizes meetings between groups with different priorities and institutional cultures. But as the morning progressed and people began describing specific challenges and successful collaborations, the discussion developed the kind of practical focus that made productive problem-solving possible. Police representatives talked about the difficulty of building trust in communities that had experienced problematic law enforcement practices. Community organizers described the frustration of trying to address public safety concerns without reliable institutional partnership. The common theme, said Lieutenant Rodriguez from the County Sheriff's Department, seems to be that both sides want sustainable collaboration, but we don't have effective frameworks for building it. Margaret Torres, who represented a neighborhood association from the south side of the city, nodded with obvious recognition. In our area, police community meetings happen after problems escalate. We need structures for ongoing communication and coordination. I listened to these conversations with growing understanding of how military experience in interagency coordination might translate to civilian police community collaboration. The challenges were similar: different organizational cultures, conflicting priorities, limited communication protocols, and the need for sustained coordination that could survive personnel changes and shifting political pressures. What if we approach this like any other complex coordination challenge, I suggested during a break in the discussion. Identify shared objectives, develop communication protocols, establish regular coordination meetings, and create evaluation mechanisms for continuous improvement. Captain Williams, who'd been facilitating the meeting with impressive skill, leaned forward with interest. Can you elaborate on that framework? I outlined the basic structure of interagency coordination as I had learned it through military service,
adapted for civilian collaboration between law enforcement and community organizations.
Clear communication channels that functioned regardless of personnel changes. Regular meetings focused on problem solving rather than crisis response. Shared planning for community events and public safety initiatives. Evaluation processes that allowed both sides to assess effectiveness and make improvements. The key, I said, is treating collaboration as an ongoing operational necessity rather than an occasional diplomatic effort. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Within an hour, the working group had outlined plans for pilot programs in 3 jurisdictions, established monthly coordination meetings, and assigned research responsibilities for developing collaboration protocols that could be adapted to different communities. Driving home from the meeting, I reflected on how familiar the experience had felt despite the civilian context. The systematic approach to complex coordination, the focus on sustainable processes rather than temporary solutions, the recognition that effective collaboration required ongoing attention rather than periodic gestures. These were principles I'd learned through military service, but they translated directly to civilian community organizing and police-community relations. More importantly, the regional working group represented exactly the kind of meaningful work I'd been seeking since retirement. Not just volunteer service or personal hobby, but systematic effort to strengthen democratic processes and community relationships through practical application of strategic thinking and organizational experience. That evening, Carmen and I sat on her front porch, watching neighbors come home from work and kids play in yards that had become more welcoming and better maintained over the months since our organizing efforts began. The street lights that had been flickering for months now worked reliably. The loose dog problem had been resolved through diplomatic conversation and practical fencing solutions. Elderly residents had reliable support networks for grocery shopping and snow removal. "You look satisfied," Carmen observed, settling into the chair beside me with tea and the relaxed demeanor of someone ending a good day. "I feel useful," I said. "For the first time since retiring, I feel like I'm doing work that matters and using skills I'm actually good at." Carmen was quiet for a moment, watching Mr. Chen work in his garden with the methodical attention that it made his tomatoes the envy of the entire block. "Are you happy you stayed in the neighborhood?" It was a question she'd been approaching sideways for months, recognizing that my decision to remain close to family instead of relocating somewhere more cosmopolitan had been complicated by questions about belonging and purpose that went beyond geography. "Yes," I said, without hesitation. "This isn't the life I expected to build after military service, but it's a good life. Meaningful work, genuine relationships, the chance to contribute to something that improves people's daily experience." And the regional stuff, the police collaboration working group. That's meaningful too, but in a different way. Local organizing is about building relationships and solving immediate problems. Regional work is about developing systems and sharing knowledge that can strengthen communities broadly. Carmen nodded with understanding. Like different scales of the same mission. Exactly. Different scales, same fundamental objectives. As the sun set and porch lights began flickering on throughout the neighborhood, I considered how dramatically my understanding of service and community had evolved over the past year. Military service had taught me to think systematically about complex challenges and to work effectively with diverse groups of people toward common objectives. But civilian organizing had taught me different skills: consensus building, patient collaboration, and the art of leading through influence rather than authority. The combination was proving more powerful than either approach alone, creating possibilities for meaningful work that I couldn't have imagined when I first walked onto Maple Street carrying nothing but assumptions about what retirement might look like. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the end of Carmen's walkway, moving with her characteristic purposeful stride and carrying what appeared to be another envelope marked with official neighborhood association business. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said as she approached, "but I wanted to share the latest updates from our regional inquiries." The envelope contained printed copies of emails from 12 neighborhood associations requesting consultation, 3 invitations to present at community organizing conferences, and a formal request from the city's Community Development Office asking if we'd participate in a municipal initiative on citizen engagement. 12 neighborhoods, Carmen said, reading over my shoulder with obvious amazement. Maria, that's a lot of communities asking for help. Mrs. Henderson settled into the third porch chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully coordinated complex logistics. The demand suggests that systematic community organizing isn't common, but that people recognize its value when they see it working. I studied the requests, noting the geographic diversity and the range of specific challenges these communities were facing: traffic safety, crime prevention, neighborhood beautification, emergency preparedness, economic development, infrastructure maintenance. Different specifics, but similar underlying needs for systematic coordination and collaborative problem-solving. This is more interest than we can handle through direct consultation, but it's exactly the kind of demand that suggests our educational materials approach could have real impact. Mrs. Henderson nodded with enthusiasm. David has already started outlining a website that could provide organizing resources, template documents, and process guides that communities could adapt to their specific situations. And the regional working group is developing collaboration protocols that could be useful for neighborhoods trying to strengthen their relationships with their local police departments. Carmen was quiet for a moment, processing the scope of what we are describing. So you're talking about building infrastructure for community organizing that could be used by neighborhoods across the region? Potentially across multiple regions, Mrs. Henderson said. If the educational materials are designed well and the collaboration protocols prove effective, there's no reason the approach couldn't be adapted for different cities and different kinds of communities. It was an ambitious vision, one that went beyond anything we'd imagined when we started planning a Halloween party 6 months earlier. But it was also a logical extension of what we'd learned about the power of systematic organizing and the hunger communities had for effective approaches to collaborative problem-solving. Sitting on Carmen's front porch as darkness settled over our quiet neighborhood, I felt the familiar weight of accepting responsibility for something larger than personal satisfaction. But this time, the responsibility felt like opportunity rather than burden. The chance to contribute to something that could strengthen democratic processes and community relationships on a scale that justified the investment of time and energy it would require. Yes, I said finally. Let's build something that can help communities help themselves. 1 year later, I stood in the same community center basement where our initiative had first taken root, but the space had transformed beyond recognition. The walls now displayed framed certificates of recognition from the mayor's office, the state community development agency, and 3 university programs that had begun studying our organizing model. Digital screens mounted in corners showed real-time updates from the 12 neighborhoods now implementing adapted versions of our systematic approach to collaborative problem-solving. The occasion was our first annual Community Organizing Symposium, drawing attendees from across the state who wanted to learn practical strategies for strengthening democratic participation at the local level. Registration had filled within 2 weeks of announcement, forcing us to move from our usual basement meeting space to the main auditorium upstairs. Mrs. Henderson moved through the crowd with the confident ease of someone who'd grown into leadership through necessity and practice. She devolved from anxious organizer trying to control outcomes to skilled facilitator who could guide complex discussions toward productive consensus. Her opening remarks to the symposium audience reflected this transformation, focusing on collaborative process rather than individual authority. Community organizing isn't about having the right answers, she told the assembled crowd of neighborhood leaders, nonprofit directors, and municipal officials. It's about developing systematic approaches to finding answers together, implementing them effectively, and evaluating results honestly enough to improve continuously. I watched from the back of the room as she outlined the principles we'd learned through trial and error over the past year. Democratic participation required structure to be sustainable. Effective collaboration needed clear communication protocols and shared accountability. Long-term success depended on building institutional knowledge that could survive personnel changes and shifting priorities. These weren't revolutionary insights, but they were practical frameworks that transformed good intentions into functioning civic infrastructure. The neighborhoods implementing our adapted approaches had achieved measurable improvements in everything from emergency preparedness to economic development, demonstrating that systematic organizing could produce results that justified the investment of time and volunteer energy. During the lunch break, Captain Williams found me near the registration table where David O'Coffer was troubleshooting technical issues with the feedback collection system he designed for the symposium.
The regional working group presentation went well this morning, Captain Williams said. I think people finally understand that police-community collaboration requires the same systematic approach as any other complex coordination challenge. Over the past year, our regional initiative had expanded to include 15 jurisdictions, developing standardized protocols for ongoing communication and joint planning that had measurably improved both public safety outcomes and community satisfaction with law enforcement. The success had attracted attention from state agencies interested in scaling the model to additional regions. Any word on the state funding proposal? I asked. Approved yesterday. Funding for 3 years to develop training materials and provide technical assistance to communities across the state that want to implement similar collaboration frameworks. It was gratifying news that represented validation of work that had started with neighbors trying to plan a Halloween party and evolved into a regional model for strengthening democratic participation. But it also meant accepting responsibility for initiatives that would affect thousands of families across communities I'd never visited. The afternoon concluded with a panel discussion featuring leaders from neighborhoods that had successfully adapted our organizing principles to their specific circumstances. Margaret Chen, who'd become our most effective trainer for new communities, facilitated the conversation with skills that had developed through months of practice explaining complex coordination concepts to diverse audiences. The key insight, said Jennifer Walsh from the Riverside Neighborhood Association, was understanding that community organizing is project management applied to civic engagement. Once we started treating our initiatives like any other complex undertaking that required systematic planning and execution, everything became more effective. Marcus Thompson from the East Side Coalition nodded with obvious recognition. We'd been doing well-meaning volunteer work for years without achieving sustainable results. Learning to think strategically about resource allocation and timeline management changed our entire approach to community improvement. These testimonials reflected what I'd observed during site visits to communities implementing our educational materials. Neighborhoods that embraced systematic organizing achieved measurably better outcomes than groups that relied on enthusiasm and good intentions alone. The difference wasn't dramatic individual successes, but consistent progress across multiple initiatives that accumulated into transformed community relationships. After the symposium ended and attendees dispersed to their evening plans, our core organizing team gathered for the kind of informal debriefing that had become our tradition after significant events. Carmen had joined us, along with several neighborhood residents who'd become active participants in our ongoing initiatives. 47 people registered for our advanced training workshops, Sarah Kim reported, consulting her tablet with obvious satisfaction, representing 23 different communities across 4 states. Tom Patterson was already calculating the logistical implications with his characteristic attention to financial sustainability. We'll need to expand our training capacity and develop additional educational materials to meet that level of demand. Mrs. Henderson looked around our small circle with the expression of someone still processing how dramatically circumstances had changed over the past year. A year ago, we were trying to figure out how to organize a neighborhood Halloween party. Now, we're providing technical assistance to communities across multiple states. It was an accurate summary of how unexpected success had created opportunities none of us had imagined when we'd started working together. What had begun as local problem-solving had evolved into regional collaboration,
and now represented a model for strengthening democratic participation that could potentially benefit communities far beyond our immediate geography. The question, I said, is whether we're ready to take on that level of responsibility. Carmen, who'd been quietly observing throughout the debriefing, leaned forward with the kind of thoughtful concern that characterized her approach to significant decisions. Are you ready for that level of responsibility, Maria? This has become much bigger than neighborhood organizing. She was right to ask. Over the past year, my role had expanded from community volunteer to regional coordinator to recognized expert in systematic approaches to civic engagement. Universities were requesting guest lectures, municipal agencies wanted consultation on citizen participation initiatives, nonprofit organizations sought partnership for community development projects. The work was meaningful and utilized skills I developed through military service in ways that strengthened rather than compromised democratic processes. But it also represented a level of public visibility and professional commitment that went far beyond the quiet civilian life I had originally sought after retirement. I think I'm ready, I said finally. This isn't the retirement I planned, but it's work that matters and uses experience I spent 2 decades developing. If systematic organizing can help communities function more effectively, then expanding our capacity to support that seems like important work. Mrs. Henderson nodded with understanding that reflected her own evolution from neighborhood volunteer to regional organizer. Then I think we need to start planning for organizational sustainability rather than just project completion. Over the next hour, we outlined preliminary plans for establishing a formal nonprofit organization that could provide ongoing support for community organizing initiatives, manage the growing demand for training and technical assistance, and maintain the educational resources that communities were increasingly relying upon. The conversation covered practical considerations about staffing and funding, alongside philosophical questions about maintaining democratic principles while building institutional capacity. We wanted to support grassroots organizing without becoming another top-down organization that imposed solutions rather than developing local capacity for self-directed improvement. As the meeting concluded and people prepared to return to their evening routines, I reflected on how completely my understanding of service and community had transformed since that afternoon when Mrs. Henderson had questioned my right to attend a block party without bringing a casserole dish. Military service had taught me to think systematically about complex challenges and work effectively with diverse groups toward common objectives. But civilian organizing had taught me different skills that proved equally valuable: consensus building, patient collaboration, and the art of strengthening democratic processes through practical application of strategic thinking. The combination had created possibilities for meaningful work that extended far beyond personal satisfaction or even local community improvement. Systematic organizing represented a way to strengthen democratic participation broadly, helping communities develop capacity for self-directed problem-solving that could address challenges ranging from neighborhood beautification to emergency preparedness to police-community relations. Walking home through streets that had become measurably safer and more welcoming over the past year, I considered how dramatically different this life was from anything I had imagined when I'd first returned to civilian status. But it was also work that felt authentic to my values and effective in ways that justified the investment of time and energy it required. Carmen fell into step beside me as we reached her block, both of us automatically noting the small improvements that had accumulated over months of systematic community attention: repaired streetlights, maintained sidewalks, gardens that reflected increased pride in shared spaces. "You know," she said as we approached her front gate, "I think Grandma would be proud of what you've built here." It was the kind of recognition that meant more than professional accolades or expert testimonials. Our grandmother had spent decades building relationships with neighbors, creating informal networks of mutual support that had sustained families through economic hardships and personal crises. She understood intuitively what I'd learned through systematic study, that strong communities required ongoing attention and collaborative effort, rather than occasional gestures of goodwill. "I think she'd be proud of what we've all built here," I said. "This isn't individual achievement.
It's what happens when people decide to work together systematically instead of just hoping problems resolve themselves. Standing on the porch where we'd first discussed Mrs. Henderson's invitation to join the planning committee, I felt the satisfaction that comes from work that aligns personal capabilities with meaningful objectives. Not the dramatic heroism of military service, but the sustained contribution to democratic processes that strengthened communities and expanded opportunities for civic participation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and expanded responsibilities as our organizing model continued to attract attention from communities seeking practical approaches to collaborative problem-solving. But tonight, surrounded by neighbors who'd become genuine partners in building something important together, I felt the deep contentment that comes from finding your place in work that matters.